Very good. My name's Tim. I'm an addict. Good evening, everyone. Now, we're going to get on to chapter 8 this evening. Now, those of you who are longer in the tooth will know what happens with chapters 8 and 9 when they get read out in meetings, is that there are a lot of complaints, and one's often a little tense because one doesn't know what ferocity of complaints are going to issue from the attendees of the meeting about these chapters. So let's tackle this head on. Now, I have some sympathy with the difficulties people have with these chapters, because I've felt the same things that lie behind the complaints. So I remember many years ago thinking, it's problematic and I feel uncomfortable with the language. Now, what I meant by that, beneath that feeling, was the observation that the social structures described in chapters 8 and 9 were of 1939 America, which were very different, in particular with different roles accorded to the sexes, and language which reflects that. So different roles in terms of who does what in the home and who's in charge of the home. Now, if you read about Lois Wilson and Anne Smith, you'll discover who was really in charge of those homes. But let's just set that aside for a moment. It presents this pretty typical view of 1930s America. And my problem with it, I thought there was a problem with the language. No, what was going on was that I didn't like that. I thought their values are different than my values. They're wrong. So that's the end of that. Now, the assumptions that I was taking to reading the book were that I could only gain value from the book if I tested it against my moral or social standards. If it met those standards, then it got a nice big tick and I could believe what it said. And if it didn't, then it was to be rejected out of hand. So I was taking this role of moral arbiter with regard to the text. And also, I almost felt as though voices from the past were going to come into the present and somehow damage contemporary society with these dreadfully old-fashioned ideas. That was I think, unconsciously what was going on behind it. Now, there was a lot of nonsense in that. The truth is, when I read books, I'm not a moral arbiter. No one has appointed me as the judge of what is morally right or wrong, or socially right or wrong in anything that I read. And I should have known this because my background is Russian literature, and one reads texts from the most awful cultures, right from the 17th century all the way through to the 20th. So I should have been used to it, but somehow I wasn't. I couldn't cross-apply the principles. My job when I'm reading anything now is not to stand in judgment on it, but to try to understand the person who wrote it from the point of view of their society, their context, not mine. Because my society, my context was not in the author's mind when the author was writing what they were writing. My job of reading, is to learn from it. It's to see if I can increase my knowledge, to acquire new practices and procedures to apply in my life. I've learned a text doesn't have to be wholly good to be useful. There are things in living sober that I disagree with, but there are other things which are terribly useful, and I've learnt to make use of what is there rather than dividing books into this is wholly good and this is wholly bad. And also, I don't think modern society is so fragile that the voicing of a lone reedy voice from 1939 is somehow going to cause contemporary society to go backwards or collapse. There's no danger posed by reading out these texts. And of course, I can find it offensive, but then I have no business reading anything except books written by people who happen to agree with me on things, and that wouldn't get me very far. So I had to set aside a number of attitudes, and once I did that, I discovered no problem with these chapters at all. Also, what's terribly interesting when I look at the chapter is, and I'm going to the readings on the website, I'll post some in the chat, but not all of them. Others I'll just read out. Right at the beginning of the chapter, it says this: with few exceptions, our book thus far has spoken of men. But what we have said applies quite as much to women. So it anticipates the difficulty itself and overcomes it really before the chapter begins. So although it's talking about a man all the way through, it's in no way trying to imply that only men can be alcoholics and only men can recover from alcoholism. And also one has to remember it was written in an AA where almost everyone was a man, so the only honest thing for them to do was to reflect the experience that they had. Also, I've often heard people say, well, I'm not a wife, so it doesn't apply to me, and triumphantly dismissing the chapter on this basis. Well, nothing there for me, they conclude. Now, I'm not a wife, and I've never had a problem identifying with the wife's position, because she's a human being, I'm a human being, I've been in close relationships with alcoholics, and so I can. It's not much of a stretch, frankly. It doesn't require much imagination. But the book itself, again, anticipates this and solves it before it gets into the weeds. So it says, what they say will apply to nearly everyone bound by ties of blood or affection to an alcoholic. So it doesn't matter what the nature of the relationship is. If I'm connected with an alcoholic, if I'm affected by an alcoholic, I'm in the position of the wife. And so, to sum up briefly, it's a little bit narcissistic of me to expect the writers from almost 100 years ago to anticipate my birth and development and pick me out of all of the possible future readers and say, we'll rewrite for him. It's not about me, which is, I think, the message of recovery. It is not about me. I'm to learn to listen to others and exhibit tolerance with this chapter. Even if things bother me, I'm to exhibit tolerance. And the great English novelist E.M. Forster wrote in 1941 an essay called Tolerance, where he says the only two possible systems are this is 1941, so he writes the Nazi system, where you simply destroy all of your enemies and then strut around triumphantly, calling yourself the salt of the earth, or to develop tolerance for others on the basis that you can't change them, and you probably can't even learn to love them, but you can restrain yourself, you can exercise tolerance. It's a really rather remarkably good essay. It's in his collection of essays called Two Cheers for Democracy, not three, Two Cheers for Democracy, which is a wonderful title. Anyway, tolerance, and that's the AA principle, is to listen, to put myself in their shoes, rather than seeing everything from my perspective, and seeing what I can learn from people. There's one other tiny quotation, if you'll indulge me. There's an English historian called Roy Porter who wrote a book about the Enlightenment, and he goes into it saying we must read about these Enlightenment writers, even people who we find rather objectionable, but we must read their writings from their point of view, not ours. And he writes this: nothing could be sillier than to tight-lace the dead into today's conceptual corsets. The most we can hope to do is understand them. All the hectoring in the world will not change them. So if I complain about the book, it won't change the book. And poor old Bill can't answer back, so I have no business pointing the finger at him. So that's a little plea for tolerance on behalf of dear old Bill. So now, I love this chapter. I can't go into everything, so I've selected certain elements. The first one, and what I've done with this is what I've done with some other chapters, is I've got a passage and I've given each one a headline. And the headline is my lesson that I derive from this. And my headline here is, control doesn't work whether you're nice or mean. And what it says is we have been unselfish and self-sacrificing. We have told innumerable lies to protect our pride and our husbands' reputations. We have prayed, we have begged, we have been patient, we have struck out viciously, we have run away, we have been hysterical. What's wonderful about that passage is it indicates a couple of things. First of all, my attempt to control anything under any circumstances, except what is within my own bailiwick, is doomed to failure. And just because I'm being nice in my efforts to control or change something doesn't make it morally better. The ultimate moral objective doesn't change the fact I'm trying to interfere with someone else's life. I've often hidden behind good motives when doing things which are unreasonable. Now, this is about the alcoholic wife and the alcoholic husband, but I'm sure if you've sponsored a few people, you'll come across the same thing. The rather sort of frantic desire that they get well will beget all sorts of behaviours which don't help. If the sponsee isn't entirely willing to do all of the work necessary, there is nothing you can do to convince them, to cajole them, to manipulate them. The bad cop doesn't work and good cop doesn't either. One lays out the saucer of water for the hedgehog and leaves it there. The next one, and this is one of the great lines, perhaps your husband has been living in that strange world of alcoholism where everything is distorted and exaggerated. No one has ever accused me of taking a hardship, a difficulty, a challenge, or a vicissitude too lightly. No one's ever said you need to take things a little bit more seriously. You seem unable to feel feelings in relation to what happens. It's always the other way around. Now, the question which I think is elicited by this is, well, why? Why are alcoholics and addicts? Why is everything distorted and exaggerated? And if my Polish astronomy serves me well, I think Copernicus was the Polish astronomer, one of the astronomers in any case, who started to propagate the idea that the Earth wasn't the centre of the universe. It was in fact, or the solar system actually had the sun at the centre of it, and the planets were rotating round the sun. It wasn't that the sun was rotating around us, and this is the Copernican revolution, this 180-degree change in what is considered the centre. There was a very funny anecdote that someone said, well, it's natural that people should have thought that the sun went round the earth because that's what it looks like in the sky. And the response, of course, is, well, if the Earth were going round the sun, what would you have thought that would have looked like? It's a very good answer. And this is the thing. I can't see that I'm self-centred. It seems entirely natural to be seeing things from my point of view. But the question is, why does being self-centred, as opposed to being God-centred, with me just one tiny atom circulating around God, why does that make everything in my perception distorted and exaggerated? The book talks about an appalling lack of perspective on page 5, a lack of proportion, the ability to think straight. If I'm standing on the edge of Trafalgar Square and I hold my hand up to the top of Nelson's column and put my hand over one eye, it will look, because I've lost any sense of depth or perspective because I've got one eye closed, that my hand is bigger than Nelson on the top of Nelson's column. And this is the appalling lack of perspective of self. What is close to me seems important. What is distant from me seems terribly unimportant. What is close in time seems important. What is distant in time seems unimportant. So the drink, and this is why self and alcoholism are so closely connected, when I'm about to have a drink or a drug, I'm looking at the feeling that I think I'm going to have in 18 seconds. And this looms huge in my life. The horror of what happens tomorrow, even though the real size of that horror massively outweighs the tiny benefit of a drink, looks like that, looks like nothing. What is close to me looks real. What is distant looks as though it doesn't even exist. And it's worse than that. It's not just space and time. People that agree with me look close to me and look important. People that disagree with me look distant from me and look unimportant. And this is the basis of all of my intolerances and my judgments of people who differ from me in any way at all. And the antidote to this is to see things from God's perspective, with God as the centre of the universe. And in the St. Augustine prayer book, pride is defined as the putting of self in the place of God as the centre and main objective of one's life, and therefore humility is the inverse of that, putting God in the place of self as the centre and main objective of my life. And if one were to say, well, what is the spiritual awakening that we achieve through the first 11 steps, which hopefully we arrive at in step 12, it is this. It is going from having me at the centre to having God at the centre. What's next? Another plea for tolerance. Understanding, not condemnation. Try not to condemn your alcoholic husband, no matter what he says or does. He is just another very sick, unreasonable person. Treat him when you can as though he had pneumonia. When he angers you, remember that he is very ill. And this echoes the principles on page 67, which culminate in the so-called sick man prayer, which I'll recount it closely, if not exactly. This is a sick man. How can I be helpful to him? God save me from being angry, thy will be done. Now, this perception of sickness, obviously in today's society, someone who's sick is someone who is depraved or perverted or beneath contempt. One must get away from that. That was not the intention when they wrote this. But to recognise that however someone is, in whatever conditions, they haven't chosen to be like that. If people are unwell in their behaviour, if people are ignorant, if people say stupid things or think stupid things, they haven't chosen stupidity. They haven't chosen silliness or daftness or even immorality. People who are without conscience don't seem to have chosen it. It seems to have chosen them. And so this is the fundamental basis for looking at everything. And I found there are two ways of handling the world. Method number one, which has been absolutely necessary for me, often for long periods, is to simply pretend it's not there, because I just find my reactions to it so toxic. That won't do in perpetuity. I think one has to find a way of handling the world one lives in, because it has a way of seeping under the door. And to seek to look at everything dispassionately I say dispassionately, without negative passions, but with compassion, with understanding. It's only if I do that that I can look at all. I can't look if I'm full of judgment. Now, toleration. E.M. Forster finishes his essay with the observation that just because you tolerate people doesn't mean you don't deal with problems as they arise, and you won't have sometimes to handle or respond to bad behaviour. So it doesn't mean that one condones behaviour. There's a line, oops, that's the wrong quotation, there's a line there. And the next passage is tremendously useful. It says, there is an important exception to the foregoing. We realise some men are thoroughly bad-intentioned, that no amount of patience will make any difference. An alcoholic of this temperament may be quick to use this chapter as a club over your head. Don't let him get away with it. If you are positive he is one of this type, you may feel you had better leave. Is it right to let him ruin your life and the lives of your children? Now, this applies in one's personal life. If someone is a devout jerk, then maybe one has to drop them. With sponsees who become unreasonably aggressive, the same. But where one sees this actually play out is in meetings when someone is aggressive or violent and tries to use the notion of, can't kick anyone out of AA, tradition 3, where's love and tolerance now, when the group tries to push back against the aggressive behaviour. And this little paragraph is wonderful because it gives us license, we have it already, but it reinforces the license we have to deal robustly with unpleasant behaviour, with unpleasant behaviour which is not merely disagreeable but which is actually harmful, essentially physical threat of some description. A lot of people are a nuisance. Heaven knows I've been a nuisance. We're not talking about that. We're talking about real threat and real aggression. And people that won't pipe down when they're asked to. By the way, if ever you're chairing a meeting and someone is, I remember there was a chap many years ago who would come to a particular meeting and in not very veiled terms pull down members of the local fellowship one by one with tall tales about their terrible behaviour. And the measure is very simple. One would say, Neville, he wasn't called Neville, could you return your sharing to your own experience, strength and hope? And 9 times out of 10 that actually works. It shouldn't work, but if it's said with sufficient authority, it does work. Another thing as well, which is very interesting, the next one, when he has a way before him to stop his drinking and abuse if he really wants to pay the price. I've hidden behind powerlessness, both with alcohol and drugs and with other behaviours, to say, well, I couldn't help it. The book is very clear. You're powerless up until the point that help is offered. By the time help is offered, you now have power available, and once you are given the power to make the choice, with that comes moral responsibility. Bob Olson, he puts this in rather an intemperate way, so forgive me for recounting this, but he puts it rather well, where he says, by the time you get to step 10, you have responsibility. In the earlier part of the programme, before you've completed the first 9 steps, there's a great deal of latitude. P.D. says when he behaves badly now, he's not doing it because he's powerless, he's doing it because he's a jerk. He uses a much worse word than that. And I've got to be careful that I keep myself morally responsible. I don't hide behind alcoholism or any, as they say, comorbidities, other things I came into the fellowship with. In my early years, I would parade my alcoholism as an excuse for bad behaviour, like I ought to be let off the hook for my lateness, for my sloppiness, for my emotional incontinence, for my outbursts, for my bad behaviour. Now, one must, of course, be compassionate with other people's, but with one's own behaviour, one can't, there's nowhere to hide once the early foothills of AA, CA, Al-Anon have been surmounted. Now, the next section, I haven't gone into the lengthy descriptions of what it's like being the wife. I have nothing really to comment on that. But there's a section with the categories of alcoholics. Now, a common error, as it were, when this is read out in meetings, when the 4 different categories of alcoholic are read out, people, when they're sharing, will say, well, I think I was in category 1 or I was in category 2. The categories aren't for us. The categories are for the Al-Anons to get a grip on what the hell they're dealing with, to understand how far the progression is. Because, in fact, the progression through the 4 stages of alcoholic, it actually, or 4 categories of alcoholic, it actually mirrors a distinction made earlier in the book, where it talks about, on one hand, the certain type of hard drinker, and on the other hand, the real alcoholic. And it says the certain type of drinker, certain type of hard drinker, if he has a bad enough shock, can stop or moderate. And this corresponds to our category 1 here. So it says your husband may be only a heavy drinker. His drinking may be constant or it may be heavy only on certain occasions. Some will moderate or stop altogether and some will not. Of those who keep on, a good number will become true alcoholics after a while. Now, 2, 3 and 4 are definitely alcoholics. And the thing is, once you're an alcoholic, you're an alcoholic. You've crossed the line. If you're on a train, a runaway train, heading towards a ravine where the railway bridge has collapsed, it doesn't do you much good being in the last carriage as opposed to the first. In other words, being in category 2 doesn't mean that your condition is any better, frankly, than the condition of someone who is in category 4. You're going to die, and it could happen at any point. But which category you're in might govern how others deal with you, how others approach you. So it might be useful in sponsorship to work out where your sponsee is on this. But this distinction between the certain type of hard drinker and the real alcoholic, here it says, some will moderate or stop. Earlier on it says some moderate or stop. Dr. Silkworth talks about, he has the same distinction, but he calls them all alcoholics, and he says there are types which respond to the ordinary psychological approach and then types which don't. The types which don't, that's us, that's the real alcoholic, the true alcoholic or addict. Now, this does make it seem that the world of addictive drinking, addiction to other substances, genuinely has this distinction between the people that can stop or moderate, the people that can't. Now, Bill let slip at several points in chapter 3. He said, this other category, the people that can stop or moderate, well, the funny thing is, when they try, most of them are drunk within a week. So these potential alcoholics, these certain types of hard drinker, usually discover, when they put their mind to it, they're as far gone as anyone. It's almost a mythical category. One comes across a few people occasionally. But what's pointed out is, once the phenomenon of craving has developed, you've already crossed the line, even if you're not getting any consequences. So the categories are interesting. We'll come to the hope associated with categories a little later on. The next one, my principle I've derived from this is never lose my balance, never lose my poise. The first principle of success, it says, is that you should never be angry. Patience and good temper are most necessary. Now, I'm a hothead, so this is extremely difficult for me. I'm reactive. I'm not going to blame the French side of the family. You draw your own conclusions about that. The centuries of Parisian inculcation. I don't know if it's anything to do with that. I do know the French side of my family is like me, and the English side are all very sort of placid to the point of being comatose on occasion. I'm extremely reactive, and almost all the trouble I've got into in my life has come from not keeping my big fat mouth shut. And some tricks for those of you, I'm sure most of you are all terribly nice and placid and are kind to people at all times, but I'm not. And so I'm going to share some tricks with you how I actually do this. First of all, I've taught myself, although I can rattle away, I've taught myself to speak more slowly, which gives me time to think more quickly. And this gives me time to think of the second possible thing to say and the third possible thing to say, and not just go with the first. I've also developed the skill of asking other people questions, of getting them to tell me a bit more before I rush in with the answers. I've developed the ability to pause. Tom W. says that you get 1 second for every year of recovery. There's the skill on page 118 we'll come to, I figure, next week, where it talks about it being the privilege of either person to a dispute to say things have got heated, let's pick this up later, to postpone. And in particular, occasionally I have to raise something, or I make the decision to raise something with Jonathan. There's something I'll request that he do differently. I figure that I have 4 or 5 such vouchers a year, so they're extremely precious. They're rather like the golden tickets in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, so I spend such vouchers carefully. I make very, very few requests. I don't set boundaries, because those are commands. That's what a boundary is. When I'm using you in the boundary, I'm simply telling someone else what to do. Dressing it up as a boundary doesn't change the nature of it. But I can make a request, and the difference between a boundary and a request is that I will take the refusal to comply with a request with perfect grace, whereas boundaries have consequences, don't they? So that's the difference between the two. But if there's something I need to raise, I wait till I don't care about the outcome before raising it, which means sometimes I've waited months before I raise something, and then I find that I find the right words, I find the right moment, I find the right tone of voice. If I've lost my balance, even if the words are right, even if I get the tone right, the truth of what I'm feeling leaks out, and it can't be hidden, especially with people that know you terribly well. The next principle, and this principle runs through the whole chapter. I've gathered together 6 or 7 quotations which cover this point very well. They come under the heading of leave them alone. My friend Anthony, who I saw last week, would write emails to his sponsor about his other half. And the sponsor would write back an email with no content, no body to the email, but just a subject line. Let's say the other half was called Andrew. It would say, in capitals, leave Andrew alone. I think this is very, very good advice. And so here are some of the examples of leaving him alone. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, there are 5 passages on it, so this is clearly an important one. Our next thought is that you should never tell him what he must do about his drinking. And this I extend to everything. Unless my role literally requires me to tell people what to do, like with students, I'm paid to tell them to do things. Sponsees have appointed me, I suppose, is the word, to give them instructions as to what to do. But otherwise, no. And this is a great principle of the AA book, which is applicable whichever fellowship you're in. And again, this is page 118, which is in the next chapter. The only way you bring about change is by talking about yourself and your experience, and if people want to mimic it, good for them, and if they don't, leave them to it. Do not set your heart on reforming your husband. You may be unable to do so, no matter how hard you try. And even better, this is great for sponsorship. If he is lukewarm or thinks he is not alcoholic, we suggest you leave him alone. So when I've had sponsees that halfway through step 1 say, "Oh, I don't think I'm alcoholic," I say, "Oh, okay, well, we have nothing else to say then. If you decide that you are, then come back." And that sorts things out. That gets rid of all sorts of empty conversations. You'll suddenly discover that that's not what's really going on. It's a tactic. It's a little move in the game. But once I made the most terrible mistake of engaging with that conversation. And for 8 weeks, this chap and I had a back and forth, and I realised after the event I was trying to convince him he was an alcoholic when he absolutely didn't think he was. And eventually I, as it were, wrestled him to the ground, and he conceded that he was an alcoholic. And then I thought, this is so wonderful. I'm so pleased with all of this work. It's been wonderful. And the next day, he called up and said, you know what? I don't think I'm an alcoholic. And I realised we were back at square one. We were back exactly where we started. And I'd been chasing the greased pig round the farmyard for 8 weeks, not realising that the pig was after the chase. We were in the conversation for two very, very different reasons. By the way, the gentleman was an alcoholic, it turned out in the end. So much for that hard work that I did. It says also, again, you should not crowd him. If the sponsee doesn't call me, it's because they don't want to talk to me, so I don't call them. We never try to arrange a man's life so as to shield him from the temptation. The slightest disposition on your part to guide his appointments or his affairs so he will not be tempted will be noticed. Make him feel absolutely free to come and go as he likes. Now, this comes in as really terribly relevant when it comes to sponsees and advice. Now, when I was new, I was 21, and I think the contemporary phrase is a hot mess. And I relied very, very much on proper grown-ups in the fellowship to give me advice, which I then followed. But it was made very clear, if I followed the advice, I wasn't doing what they said. They had given me an option, and if I took up the option and acted as they suggested, I was an adult making a decision on my own account. I wasn't doing it because I'd been told to do it. I was doing it because in my judgment it was the best thing to do, so that I couldn't then outsource the responsibility for my decision to follow their advice back to the person who gave the advice. In recovery, very, very often people will make a decision they retrospectively think is bad, and they say, well, my sponsor told me to do this, my sponsor told me to do that, and it doesn't wash. You're grown up. And of course the reason why they acted that way was because of their own desire, their own decision making. So never as a sponsor let those decisions be outsourced to you, either practically or in terms of the moral responsibility for those decisions. It's an absolute disaster. It does them no good whatsoever to let them do that. Now, even if someone does come to you for advice, you've got relevant experience, you're qualified to share the experience with them, and they follow it, they've got to understand that they have the moral responsibility there, and that might need to be explained more than once. Now, the next passage, which I'd like to talk about, to recover they need to hit bottom, is my headline. And this is the classification, where the classification comes in. It talks about the fourth class being the most hopeless, apparently, but the fourth class, the people who are really very far gone, actually being the ones for whom there is the greatest hope. And it talks at a couple of other points in the book about the greatest hope lying with those who are utterly depressed, who've lost everything because the fight has gone out of them. The receptacle to receive the programme has been emptied out, has been scoured out. And all the way through the book, in We Agnostics, it talks about that alcohol, at the end of the day, is the great persuader. Next, I mean, there's such a lot of AA philosophy in this. Happiness is from within. There's a rather remarkable line. It is possible to have a full and useful life though your husband continues to drink. Now that's a considerable statement. It then says we know women who are unafraid, even happy under these conditions. Happy, even though the husband is still drinking. I've lived in a house with drinking alcoholics, with a drinking alcoholic. It's very hard to see how that can possibly be the case. But Maureen, who was my great mentor in my first couple of years, lived with a drinking alcoholic. This is 30 odd years later. He's still drinking, the old boy, in his late 80s or early 90s, whatever he is. And she's fine. She's absolutely fine. Without getting political, we are in a climate where a lot of people will believe that they can only be happy if certain factors outside their direct control change. This is giving us a very different philosophy. We can be happy regardless of circumstances, regardless of conditions. It requires considerable work. That's a different question, but it's possible. The next line, difficulties are blessings. And I won't read out the whole thing, but the principle is this. You only learn, or I only learn, when things go wrong and I have to go to God, or I have to go to a sponsor, or I have to go to the book, or I have to go to something to get the answer. This means that challenges, difficulties, vicissitudes, setbacks, whether they arise from external circumstances or simply rise up within me with no apparent cause, or sometimes I've had minor things happen externally and my reaction seems to bring out whole swathes of my childhood or my past. What I've had to learn to do is not to resent this, not to resent God for those periods, but also not to conclude that I must be doing something wrong in recovery for these difficulties even to be arising in the first place, for these challenges to be arising, for these... I can be fine on a topic, on a domain, for a decade and a half, and then an external event happens and I'm set off again. Now, it's not because I've gone backwards, there's another pocket of growth ready. And my difficulties in recovery seem to have circulated. It's like the bump in the carpet. You push down the bump in one place and it pops up somewhere else. Now, it's not because problems are not being effectively eradicated, but because the problem which comes up presently is the one which I think God thinks is the most urgent one to deal with. And so I deal with that and I get a lot better in the area of work, and then suddenly relationships become more difficult, or my relationship with AA becomes more difficult, or my Al-Anon stuff flares up. And the mistake is to think that one is simply going round in circles and one's not making any progress. Now, the answer to this lies in a French philosopher and theologian called Teilhard de Chardin, Chardin, de Chardin, who said that spiritual growth is like a spiral. And if you imagine going up a mountain, you are indeed making progress, but there's a dark side of the mountain, which is in the shadow, and a light side, which is in the sunlight. So one's recovery goes through darker phases and lighter phases. And it's not because one's going backwards, one actually has to go up through the darker phase. The darker phase is part of the upward growth. Now, on the dark side of the mountain, the landscape below, if you imagine being in the Swiss Alps, the landscape below is going to look very familiar. You might feel, I've been here before and I'm back here again. You're not back in exactly the same place. You're on the same side of the mountain, but further up this time. Now, the benefit of understanding this is that when you're hit by something, I was hit by something last year. I had a couple of hours one Tuesday evening when I felt very hopeless indeed. Now, I'm being a little bit facetious. The period of difficulty was about 2 months, 6 weeks to 2 months. I got very hopeless at one point, but it was genuinely difficult for a couple of months. I was really, as they say, fighting the demons. But I made the decision right at the beginning of this period, this is a blessing. This isn't a difficulty, in reality, it isn't a challenge, it isn't a setback. This is a method by which God is upgrading me to the next level. And to be upgraded, I have to be shut down to be upgraded. And this is what is happening. And all through the period of difficulty, I refused to let anyone know except 2 or 3 confidants that I was going through a difficult time. And people would say, how are you going? How are you going? How are you coming along? And I'd say, I'm going through a period of considerable blessings at the moment. And they said, great, because they didn't understand what I meant. Now a few people twigged by the end of it. They said, oh, my commiserations. So a blessing is anything which moves you forward. And you want those, by the way. Some other really rather wonderful principles. And this is a premise with which I approach any difficulty in my life. All problems can be solved. If God can solve the age-old riddle of alcoholism, he can solve your problems too. Now, my job with the book is simply to take it to be true. Not say, but how can God solve this problem in front of me? No. You look at the problem and you say, if God can solve the age-old riddle of alcoholism, he can solve this one too. And this is the point about spiritual principles. You start with the acceptance, and then you apply it and get some experience, and then the experience demonstrates that it's true. You don't try to work out why it's true first. And then if you can figure out that it's true, you might think about applying it. It's all backwards from what you think it's going to be. The next thing. So to follow on from the previous one, all problems can be solved, but not overnight. It says many of the old problems will still be with you. This is as it should be. So one must have no lamenting at 4 years or 10 years or 20 years or 30 years that a particular difficulty is still there. My temper has been something, it's really the last 18 months, hasn't gone altogether, but it's got considerably better. I had to wait 30 years for it to really see an improvement. Other things got better very, very quickly. The temper, slow. One mustn't be resentful. You can't rush these things. It takes as long as it takes. A very common complaint is, let's say someone is 8 years sober. At 7 years, 11 months, they start to really take the program seriously. Lock, stock, and 2 smoking barrels. And then 1 month later, they discover they have a bad day and they say, I've been in this program for 8 years and I'm feeling like this. The thing is, when you upgrade to a new level and say, right, I'm going to really do it properly now, you reset the clock at 0. So this chap should have been counting not from 8 years ago, but from 7 years, 11 months. And I redo that on a regular basis. If I have a difficulty, I reset the clock and say, I'm at the beginning. And then if 2 months later the problem is still there, I'll say, not I'm 32 years and 2 months into this. I'll say, I'm 2 months into this particular lesson. That's why it's still difficult. And then my expectations are brought in line with the reality. And the next line echoes the same idea. In spite of your newfound happiness, there will be ups and downs. Now the thing that I said was in chapter 9 is actually in chapter 8, and we're handling it this evening. So there's a wonderful passage on handling disagreement, and it says, we do not mean that you have to agree with your husband whenever there is an honest difference of opinion, just be careful not to disagree in a resentful or critical spirit. And a friend said, imagine if that was the community guideline on Twitter. 98% of the content would have to be deleted. 98% of what I used to say would have had to have been deleted, just in the world generally. The saying, I think, in AA is, say what you mean, but don't say it mean. And this question on handling argument, I think I may have said before that Jonathan and I don't argue because we have a policy decision not to, because we don't like arguing. And the AA approach to having an argument is to say, stop it, discuss it another time, back off. This is literally what it says. This is getting serious. I'm sorry I got disturbed. Let's talk about it later. I was in a group conscience meeting many years ago where the chair of the group conscience said almost literally that. He said, things have got very heated, so we're not going to be resolving this today. Why don't we all put our comments in writing? Our long-suffering secretary will collate the comments, anonymise them and distribute them. Then we can have a good hard think about them and come back at this topic in a month's time. The meeting is closed. Amazing. So if there is an argument in a group conscience meeting, the group conscience meeting is over. That is the end of it. Shut it down. We have no business arguing in AA. If we can't do it nicely, we shouldn't be doing it at all. We need to go back in the corner and count ourselves and come back with a fresh attitude. That's a personal view there. But I think it's supported by this chapter. The next one, don't expect quick change, is my headline. And the book says, you must not expect too much. His ways of thinking and doing are the habits of years. If you've sponsored people, you'll have had the situation where you point something out and then you see the sponsee doing the same thing the next week and you're enraged. You said, but I pointed this out and explained it last week. That pumpkin, they're going to carry on doing that for another 5 to 10 years. You do know that, don't you? That when you learn a lesson, it takes years for it to really seep in through the consciousness and to get transformed into altered behaviour. A few things are quicker, but a lot of things aren't. So one's got to be patient, particularly with sponsees. Another philosophical point, almost a political one, that we change the world through example, not through hectoring and badgering and criticising and condemning and moralising and doing all of those things. We simply, as it says here, show him these things, patience, tolerance, understanding and love. Show him these things in yourself and they will be reflected back to you from him. And I've seen this in meetings. Sponsees copy their sponsors. If a sponsor, if someone who's got lots of sponsees in a group behaves badly, you'll see the sponsees feeling licensed to behave in a similar way. One's got to be terribly careful at the public level in AA, as in the public level in meetings, in group conscience meetings, in business meetings, because people are watching and people imitate. And I really do think this does work. I've noticed with people that I've had contentious relationships with, if I can remain calm, I'll give you the example. 25 years ago, I worked in Germany, and I was brought in as the most junior person in the department to help out. But what was really going on was I was sent in undercover to ferret out the truth of what was going on inside the department, identify who the rotten apples were, and the individuals were identified within about 6 weeks, and they were, I think the euphemism was, transferred to the Swiss office. So they just disappeared over the weekend. Now, I, as the youngest person in a department of 30 or 40, was then brought in the following Monday and revealed not to be the temp, but to be the new director of the department. Now, a lot of people were happy that there was a change in leadership in the department. But some people were not. Germany, if I may say this about Germany, in the corporate world is extremely hierarchical. You don't have sideways moves, you don't have leaps up. You've got to earn your stripes very, very gradually and systematically. There is a way of doing things. It's the German way, and that's the end of it. And several people, this was in the south of Germany as well, which is much more conservative, and some people were simply furious that I'd been brought in at the top of the department as the youngest person in it. And Frau Braun every morning greeted me with a Rottweiler snarl, and it took 6 months of keeping up the diplomatic face of charm and interest and how are you, Frau Braun, what can I do to support you in your role, is there any difficulty, what can I help you with, and listening to her, and eventually at the end of it she came round. It took 6 months of me not reacting to her aggression before her aggression subsided, and we were good friends by the end of that job. I've got other examples, but that's my best one. A few more, then we'll get on to some questions. The next one, again, major philosophical idea. It says, we women carry with us the picture of the ideal man. Now, this seems like a very old-fashioned statement, the sort of chap we would like our husbands to be, but if I dare say this rhetorically, do we not carry with us a picture of the ideal world, the sort of world we would like our world to be? Transfer that to anything that is upsetting. That is the model for resentment, grievance, fear, and upset, is having an ideal for how things ought to be, and then getting frightfully cross that things are not like that. And if I'm going to be happy, the ideal has to go. It might remain as something to work towards, but certainly not something to measure reality against in order to condemn and moralise it. Next one, major tool of the programme. When resentful thoughts, try to pause and count your blessings. And this is really the answer. The answer to resentment is not analysis of the resentment. It's to develop appreciation and gratitude. And I tried this with a poor, long-suffering sponsee recently who made the terrible mistake of complaining about half a dozen things in his life. And so I said, okay, I want 10 things that's good about your job, for instance. And he came back dutifully with 10 things. I said, and another 10 things. And another 10 things. And then we gradually cycled through all of the areas. I spoke to him a couple of days later. I said, how are you? He said, oh, I'm absolutely fine. So we know it works. It's impossible to keep doing those lists, because what that does, it completely defuses the self-pity until there's none left. It won't generate necessarily the feeling of gratitude, but it undoes the self-pity. And I'm going to try and whiz through the last ones. It says, you probably need fresh interests and a great cause to live for. So much of my self-obsession over the years has been cured by finding things in the world to take an interest in. Read something, learn something. There is so much of interest, and I am so boring to myself. And that's the real crime when I'm unhappy. It's not the unhappiness, it's how boring I become to myself and everyone else around me. It's just dull, 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 the same old complaints. The more I learn, the more chance there is I might conceivably become interesting to the people around me. It also says, both of you will awaken to a new sense of responsibility to others. This is the other antidote to the self-obsession, is that while I'm self-obsessedly thinking about myself, my woes, my plights, my gripes, I'm missing the job I ought to be doing for God in the world. And there's a little bit in this chapter which I've skipped over, and in the following one, which rather suggests that the wife should tiptoe around the husband in case he slips. but then it contradicts itself. Now, fortunately, the chapter does come out on top. It comes out right. And it says this wonderful line: if he gets drunk, don't blame yourself. God has either removed your husband's liquor problem or he has not. If not, it had better be found out right away. Then you and your husband can get right down to fundamentals. If someone slips, they've missed something. Either the information given to them is insufficient about the nature of the problem and what the solution is, or they've been given the solution and haven't done it. I've talked to hundreds of people who've slipped. I always ask what actions in AA they were taking in the period 2 weeks before they slipped. Every single time there are holes in the programme you could drive a Sherman tank through. It is not seconds and inches by which people fail to make the grade. It's by a very considerable shortfall in actions or a fundamental failure to accept the tenets of the programme. And the last little point, often it tells you in the book, it tells you the philosophy really through the back door, and it does this with this line: if a repetition, i.e. a slip, is to be prevented, place the problem along with everything else in God's hands. If I'm upset, my job is to place it in God's hands. It says literally with everything else. The book hedges constantly. When it doesn't hedge, take it seriously. Everything is in God's hands. I've got a work problem, it's in God's hands. I've got a domestic problem, it's in God's hands. Money problem, God's hands. Temper problem, God's hands. Doesn't matter what it is. Put the problem in God's hands and leave it there. So let's see what questions we've got. First one. Cheerfully see him through more sprees. Is this advice for sponsoring also? I may have said this before, but I'll say it again because it's a valuable question. If someone is new as a sponsee, it's reasonable for them to take a while to appreciate the gravity of alcoholism and the need, in actual fact, for them to go to any lengths. So one slip, I think, can be understandable. But once they've had the shock, and it's been pointed out quite how short a leash they're on, then I won't preside over someone who is going round in a loop. If it hasn't worked with me, then try with someone else. The fellowship sticks with them and sees them through the spree, but the sponsor has a very specific particular role. With friends, I do see them through sprees. I don't drop my friends just because they drink. They don't stop being my friends. Often they don't want anything to do with AA or anyone in it, so fair enough, good luck to you. But the ones who do, I don't cut them off. With sponsees who have been around a while, if they're around a few years and they slip, that's definitely the end of it. They need someone else, because it doesn't matter why. The sponsorship didn't work. That's the end of it. Find someone else. When resentful thoughts come, try to pause and count your blessings. Could you use this as a reference to a gratitude list? Yes. Now, I haven't historically been a very great one for gratitude lists. Part of the problem with them is that they can treat me as a recipient of goods, suggesting that my happiness depends on the reception of goods, the reception of good things, wonderful things happening in my life, because it's creating a sort of almost a causal link in my mind between the external things happening and me feeling good. I think there are two distinct activities. The first one is to adopt a general appreciation of things. To learn to appreciate something is rather different than expressing gratitude. So to appreciate, to enjoy the food that I'm eating rather than just wolfing it down, to appreciate the listening the music I'm listening to rather than simply having it as wallpaper. I think that's very valuable, to appreciate going on walks, to appreciate people that you're with. Gratitude does a couple of things as an exercise. I don't think it generates appreciation, but what it does do is it eliminates any sense that one is hard done by God or the world. It gets rid of the self-pity. It gets rid of the victimization. I had a sponsee once who grew, if you know Paris, I won't say where, but if you know Paris, you think she grew up there. What's she complaining about? She had terrible complaints about her childhood, and indeed there were difficulties with the parents in a couple of ways, which I recognise, but it was very exaggerated. And so I got her to do something that someone got me to do. I said, I want you to make a list of all of the things that they did right. And if they did something right every day of your childhood, or every day until you left home and went to university, I want you to count how many days they did that right. So however many 19 years times 365 was, for that many days I was provided with a roof over my head. For that many days I was provided with food on the table. And I got her to do this, as was done with me. Literally every single thing that the parents got right, and she said it killed the resentment, because she just couldn't maintain that she'd had a bad childhood. Just impossible in the light of this vast body of evidence. And I think it's extremely valuable as a tool against this this sense of victimization, being hard done by. I saw a wonderful TikTok the other day. I'm back on TikTok, so you won't see me for 6 months. It's under control. It's fine. I'm limiting myself to like a certain amount of time each day, and I've now curated the feed so it's 95%, 5% kittens, and 95% really heavy duty French philosophy, and that's kind of putting me off a bit. So I think I'll be all right. But anyway, there was this woman who was saying that all her friends in therapy are the ones who are the really mean ones. And she went on to, it was very, very fun, and she went on to explain that this her friend's life was not the friend's mother's fault. And she said, "You're 31, you're 31, you're 31. I'm pretty sure your life becomes your fault soon." And it just really hit home, because at 31 I was in therapy, blaming the state of my present mind at 31 on things which had happened 30 years earlier. These gratitude lists, the sacrifice, I used to blame my parents for so many things. The sacrifice that both of them, particularly my mother, put herself through in order that I got an education, it was really extraordinary. And the ingratitude with which I responded to that I had the temerity to confront her at the age of 30 with a couple of things that she'd said about my brother. And it took years for that harm to be undone. It was undone. We ended extremely well. But that's where gratitude comes in. What it does, it redresses the balance. It makes me recognize that even in really terrible situations, the awful things were a drop in the comprehensive ocean of kindness and opportunity and encouragement and good messages around me everywhere in society, everywhere in the schools that I went to. You wouldn't have known that if you'd interviewed me at 18. But it took a lot of work of actively looking at what was good to redress the balance. It's this alcoholic mind where everything is distorted and exaggerated, and that has to be comprehensively worked against, because it's absolute poison. Couple more questions. Right. Someone says, I go through the chapters to wives, employers and family afterwards to keep in weekly contact with sponsees on step 4. I find it brings up things for step 4 worksheets. Have you used this before? Or is it best to wait until step 12? Honestly, when I'm going through step 4, there's such a lot to work through. On page 67, it's got 8 questions from mistakes down to wrongs. And I simply get people to look at each area of their life systematically, asking those 8 questions. Now, where the chapters come in, I've got checklists of character defects which are based on those later chapters. So those later chapters tell you all sorts of things to do and all sorts of things not to do. So you've got great checklists you can build up from there to say, well, what did I do wrong in my relationship with my mother or my sister or my brother? Sometimes you can't remember by spontaneously saying, where did I get things wrong? But what you can do, go down a checklist and see which of the behaviours you exhibited. And as one goes down those lists, one says, oh, I did that, and I did that, and I did that. It's only by going down the list that you remember. So that's how I use that. Someone's saying, would you sponsor a sexaholic chronic relapse differently than an alcoholic? And I think the answer to that is yes. With food and with sex, my experience is that the abstinence, whereas total abstinence is a prerequisite when it comes to crystal meth and heroin and alcohol and so on, you have to be sober to even start the process. You have to be clean to start the process. With sex, it's very much more difficult. With food, it's very much more difficult. And honestly, from having known a lot of people as well who've had similar experiences to me, what you've got is progress, not perfection. But it's rather like the distinction which is made earlier on in this chapter between someone who is genuinely making mistakes and someone who is thoroughly ill-intentioned. So with sex addiction, if the slips are on porn or drive pasts or the things which are incredibly, as it were, easy access to slip on, the thing is, the slip can happen with sex addiction by going past a hoarding, seeing a picture, and something clicks in your mind, and you get a chemical rush. It's like the drink is created within you by an external trigger, and then you're sliding down the slope into other behaviours. That's almost impossible to avoid, but what you've got with sex addiction is a range of behaviours. There are behaviours which are maybe disagreeable, unsavoury and unseemly, but don't involve other people at all, don't cause substantial harm, at least on a daily basis. But I knew a chap many years ago whose sex addiction involved in particular getting a thrill out of what is referred to as unprotected sex and not disclosing to the other person that the event was taking place without protection. They thought there was a protective barrier and there wasn't. And that's utterly unconscionable. That's addiction plus something else. And so I think one has to use one's judgment. I continue to work with people unless there is unconscionable behaviour. There are ways of channeling the still rumbling on addiction in ways which don't harm other people. And also on the sex addiction front, although in principle I'll continue working with people, the fact is if they're not pulling their weight in the programme, then the same response is given as to an alcoholic that's not pulling their weight. So I think it's more complicated with food and with sex. And I've known people, of course, I'm sure we all know people who've got very good programs who have a good relationship with God, but go through periods of having problematic relationships with media, with social media, with sex, with romantic obsession, with food, with other things as well. There are other more sort of minor pursuits. And it's not necessarily the fact that they are utterly cut off from God and are entirely bankrupt. It's simply there's a further lesson here, and sometimes it's, I think, God's way of getting my attention is when I become slippy in one of the behaviours. I'm forced to go back to God, and one thinks maybe that's God's way of doing it. So I'm certainly more lenient with sponsees on that sort of thing. And last question, if people don't take on a request, if you've asked about not talking about certain topics and they want to argue, is it best to respond with "this is getting serious"? Well, if someone wants to talk about something, I'm not the policeman. I tend to just let people have their say. If they want to talk about something, let them. Very, very simple. So I'm going to stop there, Keith. I think that's me done for the day.